You're good. You're good.
Okay, let's go ahead and jump in. So I want to start by asking some questions about historical context. Before we even really get into it, all of you should have spent some time looking up Thessalonica in your Bible dictionaries. You should have done some advanced work on this. And so what I want to do is I want to just take some of your observations before we even get into the things that I want to share with you. But what are some of the things that we can find out about the background of the church in Thessalonica without clicking a mouse, without reading a Bible dictionary? And we talked about it a minute ago. Where's the first place we probably want to begin? All right, Sean?
Acts 17.
Acts chapter 17. So let's turn over to Acts chapter 17.
All right.
And, this is probably one of the most rudimentary disciplines in biblical exegesis, right? Which is using God's Word as a primary source for all of your historical and textual information. Right? We have, in the book of Acts, a fairly lengthy discourse about the history of the early church. But of course it comes to us in a narrative form, right? And so when Luke was writing Acts chapter 17, he wasn't writing 17, he was just writing. That's actually yours. And when Luke was deciding what to put down when they were in Thessalonica, he wasn't thinking that someday we would have 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, right? To need that information for. So all of the information, of course, in Acts is selective, right? And we talked a little bit about that when we talked about, well, we actually didn't talk about Acts, I guess, this past time in BX, did we? We didn't get there. So, but let's just go ahead and look at some things in Acts 17. So we're going to go ahead and read this because it's a fairly short text, all right? We're going to start in verse 1. It says, "Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul went, as is his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and rise from the dead, saying, 'This Jesus who I proclaim to you is the Christ.' Some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. But the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob, set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out to the crowd. When they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, 'These men who've turned the whole world upside down have come here also. And Jason has received them.' And then they were and they're all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. And the people and the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things. And when they had taken money as a security from Jason and the rest, they let them go." And then one of our favorite verses, right? "The brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas by night away to Berea. When they arrived there, they also went to the Jewish synagogue. And as a commentary on what we just read, these Jews were of more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the Scriptures daily to see if these things were so." All right, so just on the basis...
Maybe down to the end of 13.
But when the Jews, when the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of God was proclaimed by Paul at Berea also, they came there too, agitating and stirring up the crowds. And the brothers sent Paul off by way to the sea, but Silas and Timothy remained there. And of course, later on he goes to Athens. So, great catch. So there in verse 13. So what do we know? What do we know right away from the historical situation? How was the church in Thessalonica begun? Under what circumstances did it begin? And just raise your hand and we'll just take Jeff.
Very fast,
Very, very quick. Okay? And what do we know about churches that are planted very quickly? Or what might we assume about something that was done very quickly? What does that create?
It's going to polarize people. It's going to make people either love it or think that it's crazy and jump to the other side.
When you say people, you mean the people of the city?
Yeah.
Right, that when things happen very, very quickly, people can quickly polarize, right? What about the constitution of the church? What do you think, Steve?
They weren't very strong in the Word of God. Immature, young Christians.
Right, you got a lot of brand new believers, right? And nobody mature to help them, right? Maybe some of us have been in ministries like that or experienced things like that, right? That has a special set of challenges, doesn't it? What else do we know about the church in Thessalonica, just from Acts chapter 17? Yes? Formed under some fairly heavy persecution. What kind of persecution? By Jews. And what was the nature, what was the reason for which they persecuted them?
Jealous.
Jealous? What do you think they were jealous of? Again, we're speculating a little bit here, but what do you think? From the text, what do we know they might have been jealous about? Yes?
They were gaining followers and respect.
And they were gaining followers and respect. Right? Whenever somebody starts something new and they're doing better than the old thing, that sort of always happens, right?
Yep.
It happens in the NHL too, right, Sean? So,
And they were prominent. Some of these were prominent to people in the community.
right, so imagine this, right? You're in a fairly small community, right? The Jewish community in any Greek town was a fairly well-established and close-knit community. What happens if some of the prominent members of your Jewish community, in your mind, leave the faith? What would be the position of a prominent member in a small community in the existing faith? And what might happen to that existing faith or its credibility if that person was to convert? And you guys ever studied the Bible with someone that's in a fraternity or a sorority?
Absolutely.
You understand this, right?
Yeah.
It creates conflict. I saw another hand. Trey, was it your... Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think as a result of their pressure, they were eager to really know what the scriptures actually said, so they're diligently and consistently studying them out.
I'm sure you get that sense from verse 10, right? You know, kind of by comparison, right? What else do we know? What happened? What was the nature of the conflict with the civic authorities? What was that all about? Steve?
The possibility of an economic impact and a possibility of a political impact.
All right, Steve said economic and political impact, and again, we're still sort of in Acts 17, so we won't get to what you mean by that just yet, but that's certainly true. I mean, and how might we understand that, again, with just knowing from Acts 17, how might there have been economic impact? What do we think? Matt, did you have a thought?
I didn't know that political thought, but also that they took the money for economic.
I'm sorry, they took money from...
I had one thought.
Sure, go ahead. Political?
Yeah, when it says in verse 7 that they were defying Caesar's decrees, and the idea that they were causing trouble all over the world in defiance of that, they somehow undermined Caesar's power.
Right, they were defying Caesar's decrees. We're going to talk a little bit more in a few minutes about where that, what that allegation was really all about, right? And for that, we need to know a little bit more about Thessalonica, a little bit more about civics, Roman civics, and civics in the outlying communities. And for that, we need Bible dictionaries and other resources. But yeah, there's a political thing. But again, back to our text, if somebody prominent left your community, what might happen? That leaves a void of leadership. What else might happen? Yes? Other people might follow them. Right? Opinion leaders leave a community, other people may follow, right? The money may go away, right? And so there's different things going on here. And so what is the Jews' tactic? What is their strategy? Yes?
To say that the love Paul preaching against Caesar is that so they don't really care about Jewish faith.
Right, they begin to pit, this new faith against the Roman Empire, right? Hey, you guys are advocating another king, Caesar Augustus. Caesar, what do we know about Caesar back then? Again, not from Acts 17, but what do we know about Caesar? He was worshipped as a god, right? As deity. So, consider this, if you're living in Rome, and you hear that one of the major cities in your empire has a new movement springing up, and that movement has a king, and that king isn't a Roman politician, what might you think? Like, let's squash these guys, right? It creates problems, right? And so Paul is able to stir up a bit of a mob. Anything else from Acts 17 before we're kind of crossing the borders here a little bit? Anything else just from Acts 17 that we can learn about the history of the area? Even obvious things, maybe. Yeah, Zach?
It just seemed like a mixed bag of converted Jews and Greeks.
It's certainly a mixed church, right? It's got both Jewish Christians and Greek Christians, right? And we know from other letters in the New Testament that was sometimes an interesting mix. Yeah?
But there's
Yeah, I mean, Jason has a tough time of it, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Yes?
And it seems like they really wanted to drive Paul out because they went to Berea to do that as well. So how much determination and force they had to go and travel.
Right, this crowd of people, they find out that Paul has moved down the road a piece, down the Ignatian way, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and they go running after him. They're like, hey, this guy. They chase him out of town, and then they follow him, right, to other cities. That can't have felt particularly good.
No.
Right? Yes.
They also use worthless men to help them out. So
Right, yeah,
these guys are prominent. They say, well, we have influence, so we'll take these guys. Who knows this is an economic problem for them? You know, let's get them on our side, and we'll kind of use them to stir the pot.
Absolutely.
Cultural conversion there.
Absolutely. They're kind of using the resources that they have at hand. If you look on the slide behind you, I want to talk about some of the more, in some sense, obvious historical background of the city, okay? And some of this has more relevance than others, right? So first of all, we're going to talk about the location, then we're going to talk about this great road that went through there, a little bit about civic life, politics, and then, of course, the city's relationship to Rome. So now what I want to ask you is, for those of you how many of you, raised by a show of hands, read some Bible dictionaries, read the ISBE, did some other research? How many of you raise your hands good and high? I want to know who's going to be able to help me with stuff that you can't find straight up in Scripture. Okay. So Katie, since you raised your hand good and high back there, and you guys just kind of snuck in from Hampton Roads, under the wire. Where was Thessalonica?
It was right in the middle between the east and the west. And so it was like in the lap of the Roman Empire, between Asia and then the
Sure, you can kind of see it on the map there behind you, okay? But Thessalonica was in kind of the northwestern sort of area of Greece, okay? And what do we know about that area? What are some of the characteristics of the city, just geographically, physically? What do we know about the region from your reading? What do you guys know about that region? What do we know about the city, Katie?
it has a famous harbor that was used like all throughout
Yep, very, very famous harbor there, okay, right, a large bay. And if you Google Thessalonica, and you go to Google Maps and you go to Street View, you can actually get a good look at that harbor. All right, I would encourage you to do modern day, okay? It's actually beautiful. The water is beautiful and blue, and it's fairly gorgeous, all right? There's a famous harbor there.
Salonica today.
Is it? Yeah, Salonica today. Yeah. Yep, Salonica today. Famous harbor there. What other characteristics of the city? What other characteristics, physical characteristics? You guys who did some reading. What else do you know about that besides the harbor? Josh?
It's like a large trading area, a lot of trade, we're having a lot of traffic.
Yeah, and why was that? Why was there so much trade that went on there?
I believe because of the harbor, because it was also right in the middle of
Right, there was a famous road there, and it's on the slide behind you, called the Ignatian Way, okay? And this was a major east-west trade route across Greece and across the empire. All right, this was a large road. And who knows a little bit about travel back in those days, just in general? What was travel like? Treacherous, dangerous. Right, bandits, right? That a lot of robberies and things happen on the road, okay? So a larger, more well-traveled road would by definition be safer. Right, so this is a large road. So you've got a city that's on a major harbor. It's a port city. A city that's also right on the major east-west trade route. What does that tell us about the nature of this city specifically? I almost gave it away there, but what kind of city is this going to be?
New York City. Macedonia is like the largest and most important city at that time, just for the years like
It was one of the largest, and it was definitely a very, very significant city. Why? What would it be about a city like that that would make it so prominent? Zach?
just maybe a lot of money coming in, a lot of wealthy business owners, things like that.
Right. I mean, anything that came into the port, right? There were going to be taxes on that, right? The port brought in a lot of revenue, right? Think about the port of New York, or the port of Philadelphia, or San Diego, or okay, Norfolk. I mean, other large ports, But for you guys that are down there, right? You drive down there. What are some of the largest businesses in the Hampton Roads area besides the Navy? Well, it's shipping. Maersk, right? These huge, right? Lots and lots and lots of revenue comes from shipping. Sorry, Chris.
I was going to say, as a result of all the training that's going on, the culture just is. I mean, there's people coming from all different areas in the entire Middle Eastern area and beyond the Mediterranean.
Right. So think about the melting pot effect, right? Of lots of different cultures coming through. Again, it's the difference between living in, let's say, I don't know, Virginia Beach and Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh is. Or like a city like New York, right? It's very, very diverse. Right? It's large, it's diverse. All these things impact a church. But they all impact the culture of a city in some fairly significant ways. Who did some reading on civic life? What do we know about local politics and the relationship specifically with Rome?
Rome is a free city. They didn't have to pay for the tax the city. See, that's not a free state line because of the relationship they have with Rome. They also have a lot of patron-client relationships. They actually split. I believe they split at one point the provinces and the areas, and they actually reported to the Senate, I think, at one point. They didn't have to actually. They weren't governed as a normal. Because of probably, I guess, I'm assuming because of
The power and the influence of the economics, yeah. Yeah, a number of really important things that you mentioned actually all happened in Rome over a period of about 60 or 70 years. There was a period of time when the Macedonian aristocracy kind of rose up a little bit against Rome. And at an earlier time in Macedonian history, and some of you Shakespearean buffs will appreciate this, there's pretty good historical evidence that at one point the Thessalonians gave safe passage to Brutus and Cassius, famous for their overthrow of Julius Caesar, right? And so earlier in their history, there was tension between Thessalonica and Rome. And that got worked out in about 146 BC, and of course there was a huge economic recovery after that, and a lot of wealthy patrons from Rome actually traveled back and forth to Thessalonica, and so there were a lot of close family and business relationships. All right, and so the city became very, very prominent. And at one point, the city was so prominent that it actually became almost like a second Rome. And two very, very significant things happened that caused this. One was they received permission from the Roman government to be a place where the Imperial Senate could be called together to make decisions. All right, so think about it this way today. It would be a little bit like if the politicians in Washington, D.C., if Barack Obama said, you know what, I've been to Pittsburgh about 7 times in the last 4 years, so we're going to go ahead and let you guys just go ahead and have your own House of Representatives and your own Senate up there, and you guys are going to be able to make the same kind of decisions in Pittsburgh that I get, come on, Pittsburgh, that we make here in Washington. It would be somewhat similar to that, right? Think about the influence and the power, the ability to make laws, right? The ability to create commerce, right? To decide how you were going to do business in an empire, to make your own decisions. And the second major thing that happened was they were given the right to mint their own coinage. They were able to make money. So that would be a little bit like Ed Anton being able to print hundreds in his basement. He does that anyway, okay. I was wondering, He's got the newest phones, and I just was wondering how you did that, But imagine that you could make money. Like literally, physically make money. And so Thessalonica became a place that was cosmopolitan, highly educated, politically strong, financially stable, very, very influential kind of place. And again, about civics, what do we know about the ruling powers in Thessalonica? Who read a little bit about how did the government of Thessalonica work? Again, this is all Bible dictionary stuff. How were the local politics? How did they decide who was powerful? Anybody come across that in your studies, Drew? The 5 politarchs. And can you amplify that a little bit for those who haven't read the Anchor Bible Dictionary entries on this?
I didn't quite understand all of it. I just know there was only the Lucan account mentioned by Elder Bowen.
Yeah, I mean, the politarchs were essentially powerful, rich families, and they sort of divided it up like provincial governments. Okay, so without getting into a long political discussion, but that's right. So these were close-knit families. Now, what gave these close-knit families their power? We've just been talking about this. What do you suppose gave them most of their authority and influence? Their wealth, and what else? Their political connections back to Rome. So let's just think outside the box here. If you're a powerful politarch, a wealthy, prominent family living in Thessalonica, and your power is derived from Rome and money, and a new religion starts up, and they don't worship the guy you worship, they don't worship Caesar as God, they say that there's another king, and prominent families begin to buy into that and begin to leave your circle of friends, how are you going to feel about that, right? This gives you some insight into that mob mentality, right, that we see in Acts 17. And so we've done in about 7 or 8 minutes a fair amount of legwork, and it gives you a lot of insight into why these people were so heated. There was a lot at stake, right? When you start messing with people's money and their politics and their power, it creates lots of problems. When your face is on the currency and someone else says, I'm the real king, this creates lots of problems. All right? So, I'm the Wiz, anyway, so, no? I thought Ed would at least laugh at that.
Sorry, I was reading.
All right? So that's a little bit about Acts 17. And again, their relationship to Rome, very, very close. All right? So this is a little bit of kind of the politics that are going on to it. We talked about the location there. Of course, you can see it's on the harbor. And notice that Philippi is just north and east. All right? You'll see, so top left corner of the map for you guys. And then Mount Olympus is sort of down left. It says Olympus Mons on the upper left there. And then, of course, Athens and Corinth would be in the far south, sort of the bottom edge of that map. All right? So geographically, that's kind of where it was. And then Ephesus, Pergamum, other places are going to be over on your right side of the map, off of what is now modern Turkey. Okay? So this map obviously is not in English. I know. All right. Hey, I know. We're looking for the next slide, though. All right, I'm trying to be careful not to bump this. Anybody have any idea what that might be? Yeah, sorry about the. Yeah, notice kind of on the right-hand side, there's the ruins of an old theater. This is kind of modern-day Salonika, all right? And this is the old city center, the old agora, the old marketplace from the original city. I want to talk a little bit about the marketplace. Where did all of the persecution in Acts 17 actually occur? Out in the center part of the city. Did anybody do any reading on this part of civic culture? Anybody have anything to add here? I have some things I can share, but who knows some things about the city center?
That's where everything happens. From politics to entertainment to shopping, everything.
Yeah, it's so thinking. I don't know. Virginia Beach Town Center. I don't know for you guys that are from other places, but this is like the major hub of business, right? So it's an open air market. All right, so people would shop there. Foreigners would come through there to trade. There'd be local political debate would go on. Small pieces of community theater, right? This was where all of the action kind of happened. And so when Paul wanted to make a statement and he wanted to preach, where would he have gone? Well, he would have gone here, right? He would have gone to a place very much like this. And so by being in the middle of where all the people are, he also put himself right kind of in many ways right in the center of a place where there would be a lot of persecution. And so here in the text, it says when they kind of dragged them out, they drag them over to Jason's house. They wanted to get them out of the city center, right? They wanted to get them away from, the place where all of the persecution was. Let's actually go over to 1 Thessalonians as well and look at some things. In Acts 16, while you're turning over there, in Acts 16, before Paul and Silas head on down to Thessalonica, the persecution that they endure at Philippi, they actually drag them out into the open marketplace. And that's kind of where all of the persecution begins. This is another picture of modern-day Salonika, and these are some arches. And I'm going to share with you something. I didn't even know about this. I just figured this out the other day. I came across an interesting article about the ancient city, and I want to share some thoughts. And what I just want you to think about the way that religion and politics and Roman civics kind of comes all together. Learning a little bit about this. So these arches, they may not be the exact arches, but they're very similar to another set of arches that existed in the city a long, long, long time ago. And between these two arches, originally, apparently, there was a large altar that was built. And there were two statues. One was a gentleman named Galerius, and the other one was Diocletian, one of the emperors. And these were basically, these two gentlemen were joining hands in what was called a nuncupatio votorum, which is basically a public declaration of vows of peace. And on one of the statues, on one side of the altar was carved an inscription of Zeus. On the other side was Heracles. And Galerius is all dressed in military attire, and Diocletian is wearing a toga, and they're kind of offering a thanksgiving sacrifice. And this is all a large altar with engravings and inscriptions on them. And between the two of them, Galerius is kind of extending his right hand out towards the altar, and so Zeus apparently was connected with Diocletian. Heracles was, I guess, the patron, not the patron saint, but what would you call it when like certain people had a certain god that was their, yeah, I guess that's right. He was the patron of these particular gods. And on the back side of the altar were oikumene and irene. In other words, public welfare and peace. And the idea of this altar is that if you walked into the city under these arches, one of the first things you came by was this altar of these two powerful Roman patriarchs shaking hands. And the idea was, we've sacrificed to Zeus, and that's brought about sort of universal peace in the empire, right? And so imagine walking into Thessalonica, if you're Paul or if you're a Christian, and you're walking right past these huge statues that are all about worldly power, worldly influence. I mean, this is the place where Paul stood and made his testimony.
Right.
Powerful stuff, and I think it's hard for us because most of us don't live in cities where the connection between power and money and religion is so obvious and so overt. It was just kind of everywhere, and so I just wanted to kind of point that out. Supposed to say first, nope, 2 Thessalonians. Did any of you guys do, let's go to 2 Thessalonians quickly for a second. Did any of you, and we won't read much from here, but did any of you come across any information in any of your studies that talked about 2 Thessalonians as providing historical context or background for 1 Thessalonians? You would have had to probably read a little deeper on this, but did anybody find anything like that? Jeff, what did you find?
A lot of stuff about Timothy carrying the letter, kind of like it was weird how it was phrased. Like they already knew some stuff, but you know what I mean? It's like they would have sent Timothy without a letter. And
Can you maybe explain that a little bit more?
man, my brain's like working like half time after the
So there's some thought that perhaps 2 Thessalonians was a letter that Paul gave to Timothy to carry to Thessalonica on his visit.
Yeah.
And why might he have done that, Matt? Or what did you find?
Well, I think they talk about the persecution in 2 Thessalonians. The grammar makes it sound like the persecution is still going on, that you are presently suffering. Whereas 1 Thessalonians, they refer to the suffering, but it's almost like it's over and done.
Right.
So we're talking about that, that's why it could possibly be that 2 Thessalonians.
Yeah, if you think a little bit about 2 Thessalonians, think about the tone of 2 Thessalonians and sort of the urgency of it. And obviously a church in some sense under siege. One of the things that I found was that there's a lot of scholarship that, not a lot, but there's a significant amount of scholarship that seems to suggest that one possibility is that 2 Thessalonians was perhaps written first and written to a church that was having a lot of trouble, perhaps sent by the hand of Timothy. This is speculation, largely. perhaps sent by the hand of Timothy, and that 1 Thessalonians paints the picture of a church that's largely quite healthy, and in many ways doing very, very well, and that perhaps 2 Thessalonians was written to address issues. 1 Thessalonians was written almost as an encouragement because those issues had been largely resolved. There are some scholarship out there about that. I'm not totally convinced, but there's some interesting connections there. Again, with historical, look in Philippians chapter 4, verse 16 here. Philippians 4:16. We'll start in verse 14. It says, "It was kind of you to share in my trouble. And you Philippians yourselves know that at the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in the gospel, in the giving and receiving, except you only. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my needs again and again. Not that I'm seeking this gift, but I seek the fruit that increases to your credit." What do we learn here a little bit about the church in Philippi and its relationship with the church in Thessalonica? And what does that tell us maybe about history? What did they do when Paul was in Thessalonica? They gave him money. Yeah, they gave him money. How much? Once? Or how many times? Once? Again and again, and so we don't know if that means 5 times, 4 times, but it certainly implies that on more than one occasion, the church in Philippi sent money down to the church in Thessalonica. So let's think back. What do we know about Paul's mission in Philippi? How did that go the first time? Not particularly well. How did it go when he first got to Thessalonica? Not particularly well. So what do you think it tells us that the church in Philippi felt compelled to send money to Paul? What does that tell us about the history between those two congregations? Any ideas? Yeah. Yeah, they're supportive followers. I mean, have you ever been in a situation where you had a really, really tough time, and then you meet someone else who had a similarly tough time? Don't you kind of feel like, hey, let me help you through this time? Sure. What does this passage suggest about how long Paul may have been in Thessalonica?
Possibly stayed longer than 3 Sabbath days.
Possibly longer than the 3 Sabbath days. Did any of you guys come across anything about the timing, right? If you read any of a commentary at all, surely it talks a little bit about the apparent discrepancy between the 3 Sabbath days that are mentioned in Acts, and it just seems like Paul may have been in Thessalonica a little bit longer. Did any of you guys come across any explanations for that possible discrepancy from a historical perspective? Anybody remember what those might have been?
I'm not exactly sure why, but I remember the reason was that he seemed to have a deeper connection. He said, "I shared my life with you," and things like that.
Well, right. Certainly, there's the language, the evidence from the text itself. Right, Paul uses a lot of fairly expressive language, perhaps indicative of a longer-term relationship, although not necessarily. And then we have multiple instances of aid. What was the travel time between Philippi and Thessalonica? Which is about 3 days, right? So if they went there at least a couple of times, right? I saw another hand, Trey.
I would say maybe he was only in the synagogue years.
That's one of the things that one of the commentaries probably suggested, right? That perhaps he was only in the synagogue 3 weeks, and then he was at Jason's house for a longer duration of time, right? It does seem a little bit unlikely that Paul would have needed multiple pieces of aid, in a period as short as 3 weeks. And why do I say that? What else do we know that Paul did in Thessalonica? How did he find support? Yeah, tent making, right? He worked, right? So imagine you're fairly new to a city and you go down to the marketplace. How long do you think it would take you to pick up some new clients? I mean, at least some period of time, right?
Yeah.
All these questions I'm asking, guys, are questions about how long Paul was there, and they're things that we can just discern from the text, right? And this is kind of one of the clues. Look at Acts chapter 20, verse 4. Here's another interesting clue. We'll kind of wrap up here a little bit on the historical. There is a ton of information out there that you can read about these things. And we are really only scratching the surface. We'll look at this one more text, and then we'll kind of skim through the actual letter briefly for a few minutes and talk about what we can learn about the historical background just from the letter itself. But Acts chapter 20, in verse 4, we find out that Sopater, the Berean, son of Pyrrhus, accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus, Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and the Asians, Tychicus, and Trophimus. Among Paul's traveling companions, he had Thessalonian Christians. Right? Why might that be interesting to us? What might that provide for us that we wouldn't get just from the letter to the Thessalonians? You know, this is a little more outside the box thinking, but what do we think, Jeff?
Would have a chance to train them and then send them back to church with more motivation.
Yeah. You certainly would have done that. When you travel with someone, what do you think you talk about? If Ed and I go on a road trip, what are we likely to talk about? Not besides this stuff.
Right.
Matt, James. We're going to talk about people that we have in common. Right? We're probably going to talk about our churches. We're going to talk about that kind of thing. One of the things that's suggested about Paul's time in Thessalonica is that there seems to be a great connection if he was only there a short period of time. But we also know that Paul also had traveling companions from the church. And so that's another possible reason why he would have had extended information about the church. Okay? Back in 1 Thessalonians. Let's just kind of breeze through the letter quickly and pick out some things. So in your reading of the text, let's just make a quick laundry list of things just from the letter itself, internal things. What are some things that you noticed just from your careful reading of the text that we can tell about the situation in Thessalonica? And again, these may connect to what we already know from Acts or we know from external sources. But what are some of the things that you guys found just from reading it? So let's just go ahead and make a quick list. Yeah.
Paul seems to be like extremely emotionally attached.
And how do you know that? Paul's very emotionally attached.
I just say in chunks of like the very personal readings and kind of almost like extended thank yous, and then in chapter 2 when he's expressing how bad he just wants to see them, and I just want to be around you guys, and you don't really get much of that intensity in his other letters about like in terms of that kind of thing.
All right, so that's kind of the relational stuff. What about historical kinds of things? What can we discern about historical issues based on the things that Paul talks about? Like, for example, when Paul talks about in verse 9 that he got this great reception and that the Thessalonians turned from God to idols, what does that suggest about the people in the city, their background? That they might have been Gentiles, right? And why do we think that? Turn from idols, right? That Jewish Christians are never referred to with that turn of phrase, right, in the New Testament, right? Something very simple like that, right? The language Paul uses tells us who his audience was, right? Tells us a little bit about the history of the city. You turn to God from idols. What other kinds of phrases like that do you see in the letter, Sean?
The challenge with immorality.
Yeah, specific challenges around immorality, right? Look at verse 5 in chapter 2. Did you notice how Paul comes out so strong against man-centeredness? You know, we didn't come with flattery. It wasn't a pretext for greed. We didn't seek glory from people, you or others. We could have made these demands, but we were gentle. What kind of things is Paul facing that he makes those kinds of arguments? What do you think, Matt? Yeah, with a different agenda, right? With a different kind of agenda. That's right. What other kinds of phrases do we see here? Anywhere in the letter? Drew, did you see a hand there? You can add on Kiara?
In 2:14 talks about the suffering that they endured as a result of those who come before them.
Yeah, and that of course squares with Acts, the account in Acts, right? You know, it also talks about that they suffered at the hands of their own countrymen the same persecutions that their brothers suffered from the Jews. So what does that tell us about who was persecuting these Thessalonian Christians? Was it only Jewish converts? No, it was other people too, right? Probably the civic authorities that we talked about earlier, right? Paul mentions that. What else? There's tons, guys. I mean, hopefully you guys have read this 3, 4, 5 times, right? What else here in this text gives us an indication? They're certainly questioning his motives quite a bit, yeah. And what does that tell us about the history of their relationship? Maybe they hadn't known him very long. And when you haven't known someone quite as long, isn't it a little bit easier to sort of wonder what they're all about? If there's any new dating couples out there, I mean, you experience that, sometimes it's just
so they start to doubt. I mean, whether they may have, awesome, amen. He's gone. So they start questioning not only his background, but just the fact that they
yeah. How about along that line, how about chapter 3, verse 6? Right? I'm sorry, chapter 3, verse 5. For this reason, when I could bear it no longer, I sent to learn about your faith, for fear that somehow the tempter had tempted you, and our labor would be in vain. What does that tell us about Paul's history with the church, right? Yeah. I'm concerned that since I wasn't there very long, maybe the message didn't stick. It didn't stick right. Any others? There's a lot more. Yes?
In verse 1 where it says, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders, so maybe they're not being respected because of their good, loving relationship, instead of looking out for each other so much that they look like lazy, something like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, we could maybe infer that, right? That there were people in the church that just kind of had sort of given up on normal life, and they just, we're just Christians now, we're just going to kind of chill and love Jesus. And I've never thought that way, but Trey? Yeah, I mean, if you look at the latter part of the letter in verse 4, in chapter 4, really some of the most significant challenges have to do with their sanctification, their holiness, their personal purity. And so what does that tell you about the influences in the city? Yeah. Did any of you guys read anything about the cults or the other background in the city? Who remembers reading about, like, Dionysus? Did that name come up? Some of those other cults? Or Isis or Osiris, the sort of Egyptian Greek hybrid cults that were in the city? Who knows a little bit about those? Did anybody read about those? Besides Matt, did anybody else read about those? Trey? Well, yeah, ritual, sexual things, that was fairly common in a lot of the false religions, but the Dionysus cult had a number of things that were particularly interesting about it. Matt, do you want to share a couple of those? That's right. Dionysus was sort of the god, the patron god of the city. It was sort of their home god, right? Yep. Yeah, well, Dionysus was sometimes known by another name, Bacchus. Maybe you're more familiar with Bacchus, right? He was the god of the indulgence of wine, okay? And so the Dionysus cult was all about how much can you drink, how much can you party, and then sort of ecstatic visions, right? So basically get hammered, get crazy, see God. That was sort of the cult of Dionysus. And so you see these things, like chapter 5, verse 8, since we belong to the day, let us be sober, putting on the breastplate of righteousness. And you see the emphasis on day and light and sobriety and propriety, because the cults were all about nighttime, drunkenness, orgies, parties, right? You see Paul in the text is addressing specific historical issues. He's teaching with a certain bent because he's trying to deal with very specific issues going on in the city, right? And then in chapter 5 and verse 12, we'll finish here at the end of chapter 5, he says, we ask you, brothers, to respect those who labor among you, who are over you in the Lord, and admonish you. And he goes on and he talks about the need to sort of live in a great community why might he be emphasizing that in a place where strong community seems to already be something that they know how to do? Why would he feel the need to say something like that? And what does it tell us about what might have been going on in the church? What do you think, Zach?
Maybe it was important for them to have their own community around them.
That's exactly what it was. What you've got is you've got a group of new Christians that now need to be a community within a community. Because remember, if you're a converted Jew, you had the synagogue. But now if you've been converted to Christ, you don't have the Roman culture, the Greek culture, you don't have Jewish culture, you have this whole new culture, and there's a need for a new order of relationships and a new kind of relationship, okay? And so in a lot of these instances, guys, if you just pay close attention really to the text, you can sort of extrapolate what might have been going on, and by understanding a little bit about the politics of the time, understanding a little bit about what kinds of pressure the Christians were under, these things that Paul says, they make a heck of a lot more sense, because remember, the first rule of interpretation is always context, context, context. Paul is addressing things that to us, we wrestle to figure out what they're about, but for the people living then, they made absolute sense. They spoke to very specific needs, present moment needs, things that were going on right then, right there, and that would help them stay faithful for a whole lifetime. Okay? So we're going to take a little break here, and I think Ed's going to come up and do literary.
One other thing that is worth noting, because it'll help you to find out more of the historical context, is Thessalonica was the capital of what area?
Macedonia.
Macedonia. So besides looking up Thessalonica in Acts 20 or in Philippians 4, you could also look up what to find out more about the region? Macedonia. What's the other chief city of Macedonia that's referred to in our Bibles? So you just need to be discerning, am I getting data about Philippi or am I getting data about Thessalonica? And it may be that there's a general issue in the region. So for example, when Paul takes up a collection for the church in Jerusalem, he encourages the Corinthians based on a comparison with whom?
Macedonia. Yeah.
Right. And what was the situation in Macedonia when they went to take up their collection? Poverty, right? Overwhelming poverty, but they welled up from amongst them with a rich generosity.
Right.
So there's a little bit of a clue, too, of what might be going on in Thessalonica. Where is Paul writing this letter? Sure. And it's likely around what timing? Anybody have an idea?
Early 50s, yeah.
Sure, 51 is a good one. The reason we know that is that there was Gallio who presided in Corinth, and based on Gallio's very short reign, not reign, but his time of presiding there in Corinth, gives us a very clear window of approximately when it was that Paul was in Corinth, and it looks like that timing is somewhere around 51. So that helps us too to get an idea of what was kind of the tenor throughout the kingdom too, from a persecution standpoint, because it actually wasn't a kind of a widespread time of persecution. That won't come later until the mid-60s. Here it's just haphazard based on some local issues, as you might find in Ephesus or as you might find here in Thessalonica, because of an isolated local situation, not because of an edict that is sweeping through the kingdom. But it is important to note that you can try to get greater insight, because the Macedonian churches are referenced quite a bit. And as Brett already said, it seems like there's a pretty good kinship between Philippi and Thessalonica. And so maybe it's not a big discernment between those two churches, other than that we know there's a bit more of a Jewish population likely in Thessalonica. And then the one last thing that is of note is that as Paul makes his way from Philippi over to Thessalonica, what are the two towns that he passes by? Apollonia and Amphipolis. And he comes to Thessalonica and he stops there. Why? Because there's a Jewish synagogue.
Right.
This is Acts 17, 1 and 2. So that's also interesting to note that Paul had a very clear strategy in evangelizing that involved for the church in Thessalonica reaching the Jews first. And so the Jews would have had pride of place, so to speak, and then an expansion into the Gentiles. And whatever tension that might have caused, we know from Ephesus, it's a whole lot of tension that did end up causing in a letter written about another 5-6 years down the road for that letter to Ephesus. So anyway, a little bit more that you can kind of glean, just trying to piece through, and important to note. Now, the other thing that's interesting is that Paul took one-day journeys. And a day journey is between like 25-30 miles. A one-day journey from Philippi to Amphipolis, from Amphipolis to Apollonia, and he didn't stop there. The other issue might be is that maybe those places were not chosen by God. Now, the fact they didn't have a synagogue also helped with Paul's strategy, but the idea that the Thessalonians were chosen may not just simply be an election in Christ, but also the idea that a city itself was chosen as a clear strategy for how God would be able to launch the gospel through the greater region of Macedonia as well. And so it'll give us some interesting insights as we wrestle with the content later on with words like chosen that will appear very prominently as soon as we begin to read the content. So,
Well, there's some other interesting words like Perusia and things like that are used in Thessalonians that also have a sort of a double entendre, right? They mean other things in the Roman populace, and we'll talk about all of those. So, amen. So I guess we're going to take a quick break, or you guys
we can take a quick break, and as we take a break,